King Charles has named his youngest brother, Prince Edward, the Duke of Edinburgh, a title held, of course, by his late father, Prince Philip, for more than 70 years. It had been the late Prince's wish for Prince Edward to be granted the dukedom after his death.
Camilla's son must have believed he could manipulate the king's private home for his own gain, thinking no one would ever discover his scheme. But he gravely underestimated Prince Edward's vigilance. That morning at Sandringham started with the quiet, deceptive calm of a house that appeared entirely ordinary. The king was not scheduled to be on the estate that week. No engagements were marked on the official calendar, and the staff had anticipated a peaceful, routine day of maintenance and minor household duties. Yet beneath the surface, the atmosphere carried a subtle undercurrent of tension, the kind that makes seasoned palace staff exchange uneasy glances while moving quickly through corridors. Instructions had been passed down from above. Tables were to be set meticulously for a so-called private family gathering. Food deliveries would arrive discreetly through the back entrance, and the staff were expected to execute everything without raising questions. But as the morning unfolded, unfamiliar faces appeared, people who didn't belong, people who hadn't been introduced, people who seemed to flow through the halls as if the house itself were theirs to command. No one dared speak out. Questioning orders in the royal household could carry consequences, and staff knew better than to risk stepping beyond what was safe. Still, each movement that day carried an unmistakable tension, a strain born from following directives they did not fully understand. Outside, along the service road, delivery trucks waited, none bearing the royal warrant seal. Workers sprang into action, hauling crates of wine, boxes of ingredients, and other supplies in a blur of purpose. Their steps were brisk, efficient, almost anxious, hinting at awareness that someone of authority might arrive at any moment to inspect the unfolding event. Prince Edward's car rolled through the gates just before noon. He had not intended to be there unexpectedly. This was a routine inspection of repair work on the east wing roof. Edward was the type who did not delegate such responsibilities. He preferred to see the work with his own eyes, to confirm that every detail met his exacting standards, to sign off and leave. The inspection should have taken no more than an hour. But as the car approached the entrance, Edward's eyes were drawn to a scene that immediately demanded his full attention. Too many cars lined the front of the house, not staff cars, not maintenance vans, but luxury vehicles with personalized plates, their owners evidently expecting something significant. Men in sharp suits stood near the entrance, phones pressed to their ears, their movements purposeful, tense. White-clad young chefs darted from side entrances to the main hall, carrying trays and plates at a pace that suggested urgency. Edward stepped out, hands clasped behind his back, moving with measured authority. The head of the house met him at the steps, attempting politely to slow him down. He mentioned a family arrangement and suggested Edward wait while he clarified the situation with a quick call. One look from Edward, sharp and commanding, was enough. The man stepped aside immediately, silently acknowledging the weight of Edward's presence. The first thing Edward noticed as he walked down the corridor was the smell. Rich sauces, freshly baked bread, and roasting meats mingled with the faint scent of expensive wine. Then he heard it, laughter. Not the restrained, polite laughter typical of the king's private rooms, but confident, easy laughter from people who felt completely at ease, as though no rules applied to them in this space. Edward arrived at the doorway to the king's private drawing room and froze. The scene inside was jaw-dropping. The room had been transformed into a casual dining experience, a restaurant set up inside one of the most historic and private spaces in the estate. Wine glasses perched directly on antique side tables without coasters, some precariously balanced on surfaces over 2 centuries old. Plates of half-eaten food sat on furniture never intended for such use. Printed menus adorned the tables, thick cardstock with gold embossing. At the centre of it all stood Tom Parker Bowles, Queen Camilla's son, confidently holding a glass of red wine as he conversed with a group of sharply dressed businessmen. He gestured toward the king's personal paintings with the casual familiarity of a man speaking about his own property. Edward remained in the doorway for a full minute, silently counting guests, noting the audacity, the chaos, the glaring breach of protocol. When Tom finally looked up and noticed Edward, the expression on his face shifted instantly. His smile vanished, only to return in a forced, overly friendly tone. "Uncle Edward! What a surprise to see you here," he said, moving across the room with an exaggerated hand gesture. Edward did not accept the handshake. His eyes swept slowly across the room, taking in every detail before returning to Tom. "Explain to me why there are strangers sitting in His Majesty's home," he said quietly, his voice low but carrying an unmistakable authority. The guests nearest him fell silent, straining to hear. Tom tried to manage the moment, insisting that his mother had given her approval, claiming it was merely a small lunch with friends. But Edward's gaze had already moved to a table where a printed document peeked from beneath a wine bottle. He picked it up. £5,000 per person, 12 guests, £60,000 collected in a single afternoon inside the King's private home, marketed under Tom's food consultancy brand. No royal authorization, no paperwork, no consent from the King. Edward delivered his verdict calmly, yet every word carried authority. The event was over. Relief swept through the staff immediately, the kind of relief that comes when someone in authority restores order and confirms what everyone already knew deep down. This was wrong. Guests shuffled toward the exit, murmuring to one another, clearly confused. They had believed they were experiencing a rare, exclusive event, completely unaware that the host had no legal or moral right to sell it, and that the King himself had never been asked, nor would he have ever agreed. Tom began to speak again, attempting to salvage the situation, but Edward moved past him into the corridor, entering the kitchen where the scale of the unauthorized operation became even clearer. Extra gas burners had been brought in from outside and placed on counters not built to bear such heat. Scorch marks were evident, dark and unmistakable. Ingredients from external suppliers, none on the estate's approved vendor list, were stacked neatly near the back entrance. Thick, gold-embossed menus were piled up with the words, "Curated Royal Estate Experience by Tom Parker Bowles." Edward meticulously examined supplier receipts, guest booking confirmations, and printed schedules detailing room usage, timings, and service flow. This had been planned with precision, not a last-minute whim. Someone who knew the house intimately, knew which staff could be relied upon, and orchestrated every detail for maximum effect. Toward the bottom of the pile, a small handwritten note caught Edward's eye. Familiar handwriting. Camilla's. It instructed Tom on which rooms he could use, which staff to trust, and ended casually. "Just don't let it become a habit." Edward folded the note, tucked it into his jacket, and stepped outside. He dialed Queen Camilla. 4 rings. Her voice came through, warm, relaxed, and unsuspecting. She chatted lightly about the weather, completely unaware of the storm her son had orchestrated inside the King's home. Normally, Edward would have responded politely, with measured tone and a faint smile, observing the rules that had governed him for 60 years. Prince Edward had always respected the crown, and he had always respected the woman. But standing in the bitter cold of Sandringham Gardens that morning, clutching evidence of a major betrayal in his pocket, he realised that neither respect could guide the way he needed now. His brother had chosen to remain beside him on the throne, enjoying the comfort of routine and ceremony. But Edward himself was facing something far more volatile than any official engagement or royal protocol. The chill of the winter air cut through his coat as he waited for the briefest pause in her sentences, enough to speak, but not enough to allow a second of casual conversation. "Your Majesty," he began carefully, using her full title to signal that this was no longer idle family chatter. "Please forgive the interruption, but I am currently standing at Sandringham, and I find myself in a very difficult position. I need you to tell me exactly what you knew about what Tom was doing here today." Silence followed on the other end of the line, not the silence of a dropped connection, but the kind of weighted, expectant silence that fills the air when something dangerous is about to be revealed. Edward's measured use of her formal title was deliberate. It reminded her of her responsibility to the King, while signalling that he spoke as a prince of the blood, a guardian of the royal household, and a witness to a breach of trust of extraordinary proportions. Finally, her voice returned, smooth and controlled, but tinged with the faintest tremor of uncertainty. She claimed she had given Tom permission for a small, informal gathering, low-key, harmless, Nothing significant, she assured. She spoke with calm words, yet Edward could hear the subtle shift beneath her tone, the caution of someone gauging how much he already knew. Edward did not miss a beat. He read her one line from the price list aloud, the £5,000 per person charge, and waited. This time, the silence stretched even longer. Camilla's words came again, slower, carefully measured. She hadn't realised it would escalate into a commercial venture. Tom had apparently taken her informal approval too far. She believed it could be resolved quietly, discreetly, without escalating to the king's awareness, suggesting perhaps the household manager could smooth things over. Edward listened, letting her words hang in the cold air. She was still trying to manage the situation from a distance, still trying to frame events in a version that left room for plausible deniability. But Edward's next revelation changed everything. He described the note, in her own handwriting, specifying exactly which staff could be trusted to execute the day without raising concerns. Another silence fell. When she spoke this time, the warmth in her voice remained, but the easy, casual tone was gone. "Edward," she said, voice sharper, controlled but unmistakably serious, "I think we need to handle this with a great deal of care." That was the moment Edward needed. It wasn't a misunderstanding. Tom hadn't overstepped with casual permission. Camilla had been fully aware. She had organised it, structured it, and guided her son with full knowledge of what he was doing, deliberately keeping the king entirely in the dark. Edward ended the call, standing for a moment in the frost-laden garden, watching the thin layer of ice glinting in the winter sunlight. Then he walked back to his car, every step measured, knowing exactly what must come next. Highgrove awaited. King Charles was tending his walled garden that afternoon when Edward arrived, his presence calm but urgent. Staff directed him quietly. The king was beside the raised herb bed near the far wall, absorbed in the rosemary plants, hands dirty with soil, completely engrossed in the simple, ordinary task that revealed a side of him rarely visible to the public eye. Here was the Charles Edward knew, peaceful, grounded and human, far from the pressures of public life. Edward approached. The king turned at the sound of footsteps, a warm, unguarded smile spreading across his face, unexpected, yet welcoming, as though he truly trusted the man walking toward him. Two protection officers lingered near the garden gate, but Edward paused, acknowledging their presence and the weight of his own position. "First, Your Majesty," Edward said, voice firm, formal, carrying the authority required in the presence of both guards and family. The king nodded subtly to the officers, dismissing them just enough to allow a private conversation. The smile faded slightly, replaced by a careful watchfulness as he registered Edward's serious expression. Edward detailed the events at Sandringham, leaving nothing out. He described the cars lining the driveway, the strangers in the drawing room, the half-empty glasses, and the careless placement of wine on antique tables. He explained the menus, the branded experience, the external suppliers, and the scorched kitchen counters. Every meticulous element of the day was accounted for. Then Edward pulled the folded note from his pocket, holding it out carefully. The king accepted it with both hands, studying Camilla's handwriting in silence. He read it once, then twice, letting the weight of its implications settle in the quiet garden. Outside the walls, the world seemed to vanish. The wind stilled. Birds were silent. Only the two brothers, the note between them, and the grave understanding of what had happened remained. "She knew," the king said quietly, almost to himself. Edward nodded. "How much?" the king asked, voice low, controlled. £60,000 in one afternoon, Edward replied. The king stood slowly, walking to the far end of the path, hands behind his back, staring at the garden as if drawing strength from its calm. For long moments, he remained silent, every inch the monarch trained to command presence and control in the public eye, yet vulnerable in this rare, private revelation. Finally, he turned back to Edward, face composed, voice steady, unwavering. "I want the lawyers called tonight." Those words signalled a shift. What had begun as a delicate family matter was now a matter of legal consequence, with ramifications that could ripple far beyond the garden walls. By the following morning, Palace lawyers were gathered at Clarence House, 3 of them seated around the table, files open, expressions impeccably neutral as they prepared to navigate a situation anything but neutral. The question that had brought the family and legal advisers together in the grand room of the palace was simple in theory, but complex in practice. On paper, the issue was straightforward: unauthorized use of a crown property for commercial purposes without approval from the relevant royal household offices. Legally, it was clear-cut. Personally, however, it was a storm. The person involved was tied to the king by marriage, which only added layers of sensitivity and potential fallout. The lawyers were careful with their words, deliberate and precise, understanding that in a palace setting, phrasing could carry as much weight as the law itself. The guests who had attended Tom's exclusive royal experience had been led to believe they were receiving a rare, privileged insight into life inside a king's estate. They had paid handsomely, £5,000 each, expecting something extraordinary. In reality, they had been misled. The phrase unauthorized use recurred throughout the discussion, accompanied by misrepresentation. One voice, cautious and barely audible, used the word fraud, and it hung in the air longer than anyone wanted, unshakable and heavy. Every person in that room understood that this was not a trivial slip. The most delicate part of the discussion was Camilla's involvement. She had not been physically present at Sandringham during the event, but the handwritten note she left to Tom made her a central figure in the planning. The note was precise. It identified which rooms could be used, which staff members would handle the day without raising concerns, and even suggested operational details that would allow the event to proceed unnoticed by those with higher authority. This was no accidental oversight. This was guidance, planning, and intentional facilitation. A lawyer placed the note into a clear plastic sleeve and set it in the centre of the table. "If this ever leaves the family," he said carefully, "this note will be Exhibit A." The weight of that statement pressed down on everyone in the room. A public case, the legal team explained, would not only expose the breach, but risk reputational damage that could outlast any court verdict. The recommendation was unanimous. The situation had to be resolved internally. The king agreed, but internal resolution did not mean that it would pass without consequences. 3 days later, the family gathered at Windsor Castle for dinner. Everyone arrived on time, knowing that punctuality would demonstrate respect for the rules and acknowledgement of the seriousness of the matter. Camilla and Tom were present, their composure measured and deliberate. Tom spoke minimally, his tone cautious, his gestures carefully neutral. Camilla, for her part, maintained the mask of calm and elegance she had perfected over decades, but those familiar with her could see the strain beneath the surface. Conversation at the table was stilted. Exchanges began and halted mid-thought. Sentences left unfinished, glances exchanged like coded messages. Edward observed quietly, cataloguing the room's dynamics. Every sideways glance, every pause, every carefully measured tone carried meaning. The atmosphere was thick, tense, and uncomfortable. No one could ignore the invisible weight of responsibility, the undercurrent of consequences, or the knowledge that every action or inaction could be judged later. As the meal concluded and the staff cleared the table, the king's voice finally broke the tension. He made his decision known with quiet authority, deliberate and unflinching. Tom Parker Bowles was immediately and formally banned from all Crown and private royal estate properties for a minimum of 5 years. Any future request to enter would require explicit written approval from the King's private office and would be reviewed at his discretion alone. The £60,000 collected that afternoon was to be donated entirely to one of the King's charitable foundations. Furthermore, Tom was instructed to write personal letters of apology to every member of the Sandringham staff affected by the event. These were individuals who had been placed in an unfair and impossible position, forced to manage chaos that should never have reached them. Their trust and professionalism had been exploited, and the king ensured that their labour and integrity were acknowledged. Camilla's position, however, was addressed quietly and internally. No announcement, no press coverage. Her informal authority over the private estates was revoked. Going forward, All decisions regarding the estates would go directly through the king's office. It was a permanent, deliberate measure, invisible to the public eye, yet immediately felt by anyone working within the royal structure. On the surface, she continued her public duties without interruption, appearing alongside the king with the same poised composure. Yet within the palace walls, the shift in power was tangible, undeniable, and irrevocable. Tom remained silent. He did not argue. He did not attempt to negotiate. He nodded once, acknowledging the decision, and that was enough. There was nothing more to say. Letters were sent, the donation was confirmed, and the order was enforced. The consequences had been applied, quietly, but with maximum effect. That weekend, the king returned to Highgrove. He knelt once more in the walled garden, pressing soil around the rosemary in his habitual care. There was a ritualistic serenity in the act, hands in the soil, focused on something ordinary, something grounding. Publicly, he said nothing. He never did. Privileged matters of the family, particularly those that involved breaches of trust, were never discussed in the press. But before the dinner had concluded at Windsor, the king had given Tom one final, personal statement, his voice calm, composed, unwavering. The estates are not assets to be borrowed. They are a responsibility to be carried. Simple words, delivered without flourish or anger, but with authority that transcended any legal ruling. Everyone in the room understood their meaning fully. Those sentences did more work than fines, bans, or letters ever could. They named the violation and, more importantly, highlighted the cost, the betrayal of trust, the weight of privilege, and the responsibility owed to those who rely on it. In the palace, trust is fragile, invisible, and invaluable. Once broken, it leaves scars that no legal framework or financial restitution can erase. And within these walls, those lessons are felt more acutely than they are ever spoken. So, what do you think? Was the king right to handle this entirely behind closed doors? Does the secret punishment signal a permanent fracture in trust within the royal family, or is it a measured response to protect the institution? Share your thoughts below. Your opinion matters. If you found this story revealing, stay with us. Like, comment, and subscribe for more inside looks at the royal world. Don't forget to click the video next on your screen. You'll want to see what unfolds next in these royal dramas.